And we are now live on YouTube.
We are live. Well, let's call this meeting to order. 2021 Yamaha County Budget Committee meetings.
Excuse me.
And
Before we get started, I don't think everybody here knows each other. So if I may just jump in and let everybody introduce everyone. So please bear with me. I thought it would be instructive since we have a new budget committee member, but I do want to introduce and welcome back Denny Elmer. Denny Elmer was our chair last year and has been on the budget committee for 3 years. He owns several businesses in Yamhill County, including he and his wife, including Union Block Coffee, The Oak, and Douglas on 3rd Boutique Lodging, Craft Mark, Reclaimed Lumber, and several RV parks, including a new one in Sheridan. And he has served on the budget committee for 3 years. Also we welcome back Rick John. Rick John, interestingly enough, is an Air Force veteran and used to be a air traffic controller. He got a job at Hagen Hamilton and 10 years later bought the company and has been the sole owner since then. And also his civic involvement includes serving on Willamette Valley Medical Center's board for 10 years, Hillside Manor's board, currently on the board of Oregon Mutual, and he's been married for 42 years to his wife, Kathy. Denny's been married to Lucetta for 29 years. In any event, we're very happy to have you back, Rick. Thank you very much. And we have a brand new budget committee member, and she is Doreen App. Doreen has been in the banking industry for 31 years in 3 different states and has been a commercial lender since 2001. She emigrated to the United States as a child and became a citizen in 2013 and a resident of Yamhill County since 2011. She and her husband, Kevin, have 3 children and they live in Yamhill County. Very distinguished budget committee. Thank you all for taking time to do this. So I just think it's important that everybody knows who everybody is, and thank you so much for being with us.
thank you, Mary. So we move to election of officers. Is that correct? Are you hearing me? Okay. My screen is freezing up continuously, and I'm only getting about half the words of everybody. I'm a little about my connection right now.
Okay. I would nominate Denny Elmer for chair for another year.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor of Denny being chair, signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. And now it's all yours, Denny.
Wonderful. Let's move to.
Well, we still have a, excuse me. Hi, Carrie. Yes, I'm doing that right now. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, we still need a secretary, but if you wanted to.
Oh. Move. Do we have a nomination for secretary?
I would nominate Rick John for secretary.
Second.
And no offense, Doreen, I just want to make sure that you focus on.
No offense taken.
All right, all in favor of Rick John as secretary, say aye.
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 Opposed? Congratulations, Rick.
Thank you.
We can now move to approval of the minutes, May 4th, 2020.
So moved.
So moved. Any
Second.
there's no discussion? All right, all in favor of approval of the minutes, May 4th, 2020?
Aye.
Signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, so moved. Ken, you are up.
All right. Thank you, Chair. And congratulations on another year of being the chair. And
4 years in a row. So yeah, it's great. I don't know what the record is, but I got to be close.
you know,
Thank
so
you, Mary.
we'll keep an eye, and hopefully if you have too many technical issues, just I do know that we're trying to minimize, recognizing that we're doing this 100% virtual, and it could have some impacts on network capacity and what you have in various scenarios. So that's why we're trying to limit the number of folks that are on the panel and that have cameras on and things like that. So hopefully that'll help minimize any broadband issues. So on that, I am going to go ahead and introduce myself, especially I haven't met Doreen yet, but my name's Ken Huffer. I'm the county administrator. I'm also the county's budget officer. And so as part of the annual budget adoption process, the first thing that we start off with is I provide a quick budget message for the year. And I have a presentation put together, and I'm going to go ahead and share screen, but I also emailed a copy of it to each of you. So if it's easier to follow along with the PDF handout, I'm going to be trying to use PowerPoint, and I'm still working on the bugs on presenting a PowerPoint in the Zoom platform. So just know that if you have a question, please interrupt me, because I might not be able to see the hand raise or something along those lines. So feel free to interrupt me if you have a particular question on a slide before I move on. So that being said, I am going to share screen here. And everyone can see the screen okay?
Yes, Ken.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So first off, I want to echo what Commissioner Starrett, started off the meeting. And I just want to, first, I want to welcome Doreen as our newest budget committee member. And, I know this presents some challenges doing your first budget committee meeting on a virtual platform, where typically we've, when we're meeting in room 32, we've had the advantages of, you could pass a note or ask me a question, or I could kind of help, navigate through the binder. I recognize that this is going to present some challenges, and we'll try to do our very best to assist, because I know we have a lot of information and a lot of presentations to go through over the next 3 days. I also want to welcome back Denny and Rick. Thanks again for your willingness to serve on the budget committee. The budget committee process is a really important process for the county. This is where we, it's adopting our annual budget is one of the key functions of my office in getting this budget put together in all of our departments, because this outlines our priorities and how we're going to operate and the services that we're going to be delivering over the next 12 months after July 1. So the meetings, we're doing this a little bit different this year. Last year we did kind of a hybrid, which was a combination of virtual presentations while we were in room 32. Based on the current pandemic and the restrictions that are in place, we decided to do 100% Zoom this year. We're going to have a lot of folks joining the meetings. We're also streaming this meeting on the YouTube page. And so it's readily available for the public to view and submit questions as part of the public hearing tonight. The one thing that I just want to say that just based on observations before I jump too far into the presentation too, I think one of the observations or experiences that I've had with virtual meetings, it seems like virtual meetings have a tendency to run a lot longer than they do when they're in person. And I've asked department heads to keep that in mind on the presentations, because 3 days of sitting in front of a computer screen and looking at our monitors, and if we start running, we already have a pretty ambitious schedule to get through a $155 million budget. And it's, so I'm going to be encouraging folks to, to keep moving, through their presentations, keeping in mind that we have a lot to go over the next 3 days. So if there's no questions at this time, I'll just open up. Are there any questions before I jump into the presentation? All right, hearing no questions. And again, feel free to interrupt me, because I don't necessarily, the way I'm presenting, I can't see if somebody raises their hand or poses a question. So if any of the budget committee members have a question on a particular slide, please feel free to interrupt me. So again, like I highlighted before, what is the budget? This is an overview. This first slide is an overview of the budget process. This is our financial plan containing estimates of expenditures and revenues for the fiscal year starting July 1, 2021. Everything that you're going to see this week has been put together, and we follow a process that's established by Oregon local budget law, which is Chapter 294 of Oregon Revised Statutes. We started this budget process last fall, and which is typical on internally. It starts with internal discussions. So in November, we start building internal tables. We start looking discretionary allocation. We start forecasting beginning balances. We forecast revenues for the next year. And so we really start in November and December. And then in January, the Board of Commissioners adopted budget instructions that we put out to departments. And then we issue those budget instructions to department heads. And then in the month of January and into early February, all of the departments are building their departmental level budgets. And then the admin team also is working on those internal budgets and budgets and internal funds that we'll be going over. In February and March, we did administration review of initial departmental budgets. Historically, we've had a Board of Commissioners review of the service team presentations, but that was something that's not required under budget law. And the challenges with putting together multiple meetings to go through these budgets, it was elected again that we would forego the meetings in April and just present the budget to the budget committee in May. So you're going to hear about different versions. So the initial budget is called version 10, and that's what departments first entered. And what you're going to be reviewing is version 20, which is the proposed budget. So during the administrative reviews, we made just housekeeping changes or made corrections that we identified when the departments entered their budget, and then we rolled that into version 20. And so the budget being presented to you this week is the version 20. And if everything goes well and goes right on Wednesday, the budget committee would then be taking an action to consider approving the budget and moving that to version 30, which then would come back before the board in June. There would be a second hearing on that budget. And then in June, the Board of Commissioners would move to adopt that budget and move it to version 40, which is the final adopted budget for the year. Before we get, and this slide's going to look familiar because this was a new slide that I added last year. We were in the early part of COVID-19 of the pandemic, and I think it's really important to highlight some of the challenges that we've had in 21 or in 2021, the current fiscal year. I just want to highlight that throughout the current fiscal year, we've been operating under both state and local declared emergencies. Our public health department has been on the forefront of responding to the pandemic. We've continued to deliver services throughout the pandemic. While we've had to modify our service delivery in a lot of areas, utilizing telework and telehealth and a lot of other options available, we've here at the county, we've had to modify, but I think it's really important to emphasize that the county has continued to deliver those critical services that we provide to the community. Last year, Yamhill County received CARES Act funds to offset the response costs, and then also offering some community support. And I have another slide where my next slide will go into more detail. And then the last bullet I just wanted to highlight is this is late breaking, and you're not going to see it built into the budget because it's going to be something I'm going to be bringing forward, is the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. And there is a direct allocation that's coming to the county of $20.77 million. Later this week, I'll be submitting a proposal for the budget committee to include that 20 million. I just want to, again, just highlight that what you're going to see in the presentation for the budget message, and as we go through the full budget presentation, it does not have that $20 million incorporated into the budget. So that's going to be something that's going to be important that the budget committee is going to take action on this week to include as part of the 21-22 budget. So just a really quick on CARES Act, we did have $3.6 million, just over $3.6 million that was available to Yamhill County on a reimbursement basis. It's a little bit different than ARPA, where we're going to be receiving funds straight from the U.S. Treasury. CARES Act, we had to submit for reimbursement through the state. The state had a direct allocation, and then the county would submit for reimbursement for those expenses. And over the last 12 months, 1.6 million of those funds were used in what I call internally, which was for payroll, supplies, leaves, improvements in direct response to COVID-19. And then also part of that 3.6 million, 1.9 million, almost $2 million was put out in various grant programs. There was 2 emergency business grant programs, and then several large projects that the Board of Commissioners approved funding for out of our CARES Act allocation. In addition to the CARES Act allocation, in late November, early December, the state also released another $1.4 million that was used for emergency business grants. And that had a really quick turnaround because we had to have agreements in place before close of the calendar year. But that, again, that was another round of emergency business grants that we put out to the community. And then one thing that was different is, and the reason I'm calling attention to the CARES Act and then the additional funds that came through, is the Board of Commissioners had to adopt a supplemental budget. We were running up against our appropriation authority, and you're going to hear me use that phrase a lot through the presentations. But when we adopt the budget, we set our spending limits, which is our appropriation authority. We started with this unanticipated revenue that we received related to CARES Act. We were running up against our appropriation authority. And so the Board of Commissioners held a hearing and adopted a supplemental budget that in turn allowed us to make sure that we had all the funds fully appropriated to make use of those. So next is the American Rescue Plan Act. Again, this was went into law in early March. We're anticipating the first 50% of the allocation we're supposed to receive within 60 days of passage, which my estimation has it right around May 10th that we're supposed to receive, and a direct allocation from the U.S. Treasury, the checks in the mail. And there hasn't been any decisions yet made by the board if whether or not we're going to need to do a supplemental budget or access any of those funds during the current fiscal year. If we do that, we'll probably have to do a second supplemental budget for this year, and then how that's incorporated or whatever spent is going to have an impact going into the next year. We'll have to make some modifications on how I built that. But again, I'm really trying to flag this for later in the week so it's on your radar that this is going to be a big discussion item to have prior to approval of the budget. And again, I have this note here that what I'm now calling ARPA, the ARPA funds, it's much easier to say than the American Rescue Plan Act over and over and over again. But the ARPA funds are not reflected in the budget overview or the numbers that I'm about to show you. And so add $20 million to every line where I'm talking about the proposed budget for next year. Any questions on the CARES Act or American Rescue Plan Act funds before I move into the budget overview? Okay. So the first slide that I'm going to start with, this is our current fiscal year. This is the 2021 adopted budget. This does include the supplemental budget in those numbers. And so this is to provide just an overview. This is a breakdown by service team. With the supplemental budget, the total budget was $158,568,700. Sorry, my screen cuts off because of where everyone's picture is. So you can see the breakdown. Again, it's not unusual. HHS represents, one of the largest service team breakdown of the total budget. And then next is criminal justice is the next largest. So let's look at 21-22. There's really no changes in the percentage. HHS still represents the largest budget. Excuse me one moment while I grab my notes. And what we have, what we're presenting this week is a budget that totals $155,959,110, which is about 2% less than the supplemental budget because it includes the CARES Act. But keeping in mind, again, when you add in those ARPA funds, that's going to have a pretty significant impact to what this budget's going to look like. So it's going to be closer to 170 million, which is going to be one of the largest budgets that the county's ever had. And what you're going to see is, again, HHS represents the largest share of the service team, followed by criminal justice. However, when you factor in that additional funds, typically how we budget that, it's going to show up in that general government. So now all of a sudden, the general government fund and the internal services and how we set up the special revenue fund are going to be impacted, and then funds will get transferred out of that special revenue fund. So this slide is subject to change, but again, HHS historically has always been the largest budget. Ever since Affordable Care Act went into place and HHS grew over the last dozen years, they represent the largest budget. So next, let's talk about the revenues. We're going to go into more detail. So in 2021, this is what the breakout looked like. As you can see, taxes only represent 16% of the total budget. The other larger categories, again, are those balances, intergovernmental agreements. That's a large portion of the budget. Fees and charges. Those are the main categories that are the revenues that we use to build our budget on an annual basis. And again, that intergovernmental line is going to change quite a bit with that additional $20 million that's coming in from the US Treasury. That's where that revenue is going to be recorded. So the next slide is just a quick comparison to look at what we have built into the new fiscal year as compared to the current fiscal year. you're going to see that balances that to offset some of the increases in expenditures that I'm going to get into in future slides, and also some impacts to some of the departments that are almost solely intergovernmental revenue. There's some legislative changes that are impacting where there may be some reductions in funding pending the adoption of the state budget, but we're forecasting to see some cuts in those areas. You're going to see that departments are budgeting less and having to use more of their balances. So for one of the first times in quite some time, you're going to see where the budgeted beginning balances are down slightly. There's also some in the balances are down somewhat based on some actions that we took during the budget process last year as well. If everyone who remembers last year, we did a pretty substantial transfer out of the insurance reserve to move some of the balances that we had to put it back out to department to offset some of the increased costs that they were experiencing in other areas and potential revenue impacts. Otherwise, revenues have held pretty well flat, and it's pretty comparable to last year. And again, I just want to highlight these are not actuals, these are budgeted numbers. And here you can see the next slide is just a 5-year revenue comparison. So you'll see that we've gradually, we've seen some dips in balances. Taxes have actually, the revenues associated with taxes, we've seen those slowly on the increase. Some of that has been with some additional tax revenues that went into effect a few years ago, like the marijuana taxes, which we saw a little bit of an increase there. But we've also seen an increase in what the assessor's office has been seeing as far as tax revenue for property taxes coming in as well. Intergovernmental, I think when you look at the last year and you're going to see that number went really high, that takes into account the 3.6 million, actually almost $4 million of CARES Act funding that we received. That's all recorded as intergovernmental. And so for when you're going to see this slide change substantially, where the 21-22 budget with that increase of the ARPA funds, that of course it's going to go even higher. And so it's going to look skewed a little bit because again, this is unanticipated revenue that we're receiving. Just a really quick, this is a slide that you see, we use it every single year. It's just showing that breakdown of the historically, if you look at back at 02, 03, the breakdown between discretionary and dedicated, and keeping in mind that was a much smaller budget in 2002, 2003. As compared today, you're going to see that the percentages are still fairly close. That breakdown between what we call discretionary or general fund revenue is another term for it, as compared to dedicated funding, which is restricted funding or intergovernmental, or just that combination of funds that we have that aren't necessarily discretionary. Discretionary, the county can use it for any service or purpose allowed by Oregon state law. So whereas the dedicated funding, those are usually targeted for a specific service or target area, and there's restrictions or limitations on how you can use that. So now I'm going to get into more detail about the discretionary or general fund revenue. So what you're going to see, and this is all going to, when we go over Fund 10002, this is our discretionary general fund breakdown. And it's not just property taxes. The other part to highlight is we do have some beginning balance. If we ended up collecting more than what we had budgeted, that's typically what drives the beginning balance. Or if during the budget adoption process, it's decided to hold some in reserves, we have that reserve for the future. And that's really the two numbers that really drive the beginning balance. As you can see with the current year taxes and working with the assessor, we're forecasting that tax revenue should come in at $24.7 million. And then you see what we call internally the lesser taxes, which is a combination of the amusement tax, which is the video poker, you have the cigarette tax, the liquor, the marijuana, etc., that get built into that discretionary revenue. These were all kind of challenging to really forecast during the with all the lockdowns and everything that was happening over the last 12 months. However, all the forecasts have been coming back that, you know, liquor and marijuana are doing well as far as tax revenue. But we are keeping an eye on, because these are some of the funds that with the final adoption of the state budget could be impacted by legislative changes at the state. Pool and bond interest. Oops. Pool and bond interest. This is one that we're keeping an eye on. With the pandemic, we've watched the pool interest. We have to keep our funds in an interest-bearing account, which we do at the LGIP, which is at the state level. They manage that, and then we also work closely with our county treasurer, and that's where the bond interest comes in. These are the ones that are specific to the general fund. We do any earnings. This is only a part of the portfolio. The treasurer has, I believe the investment levels right now is right around 27 million. So only a portion of that is general fund. We also, any interest earned on those dedicated or restricted funds go back to those restricted departments. So you'll see pool and bond interest in all, you know, when we start doing the budget presentations, but you're going to see that they're down quite a bit. We're projecting them to continue to be down. The interest rates for our LGIP account has been really, really low, unlike in previous years where it was constantly, you know, we were seeing it go up a percentage point, it seemed like each year. But then in light of the pandemic, we've seen it go down pretty drastically. So we're trying to be really conservative in our estimates on what that revenue is going to look like. So allocation of discretionary funds for 2021. And thank you, Carrie Hinton, who worked really hard to put together your budget binders that were provided. You should have a document in the front there that's what we refer to as the discretionary allocation table. And that just shows the current year and what's been set up for starting to do the budget year and how we track all of the changes. That's something that I use for tracking all the changes, everything that gets approved for this week, any changes in discretionary allocation, and anything that gets approved by the board in later budget actions. So what this slide depicts is really that breakdown on how we allocate that 32 million, a portion of that 32 million that goes out to departments. You can see the largest part goes to criminal justice at almost 70%, or just over 69% of discretionary funds go to criminal justice. That's district attorney, sheriff's office. A small portion goes to community corrections for misdemeanor supervision. So a lot of this is for the sheriff's office in particular. They're the largest portion of that discretionary allocation. Again, you see a small amount that goes to Health and Human Services. Again, they have one of the largest budgets, but they only get 7% of the discretionary allocation. And that's specific to several programs that there's no Medicaid funding, or it's not tied to OHA. There's no direct funding that may be coming from the state. So a majority of that might be discretionary. And then general government is the second largest one. And that's everything from the assessor's office to central admin to IT to, again, there's a lot of categories within that general government. that we don't necessarily have a lot of agreements with OHA or anything. That's to operate the county. So that's the breakdown for 2021, the current fiscal year. Now I flip to 21, 22, and you're just, you're not going to see much of a change as far as what is built into as far as the breakdown on what's provided to the service teams. Criminal justice still represents the largest share of the discretionary, followed by general government, and then by HHS. I will say, as part of the budget instructions and the early process, the board did approve an initial 3% increase to allocation that went across the board. So every department received a 3% increase to start building their initial budgets. This next slide is just to show the trends, a 10-year trend on the discretionary allocation. And again, you'll see that criminal justice, we've seen a number of increases and a number of requests over the last several years, that especially from the sheriff's office, and a lot of needs in that office. And again, they primarily utilize discretionary funds to fund their operations, a large portion of their operations. So again, this is just to show a 10-year trend. And if you look down below, you'll see everyone else, all the other service team categories have held relatively flat. We've had some increases, and you're going to see some requests later this week for some of the general government seeking some additional increases. So any questions on the revenue section before I jump into expenses? And I know if I'm going really quickly, I'm trying to be mindful of the time that we have some presentations, but I don't want to be so quickly that I run past the ability to pose a question about any of the revenues that I've talked about. No questions? All right. So let's talk about expenses.
Ken?
Oh, yes.
It's Lindsay. So in your opening statement, the 2021-22 budget is, you stated it's 2% less than 2021, but the personnel costs are rising at about 8%. So just to clarify, you made up for that in materials and services in the budget instructions?
I'll have to, that's going to be coming up in the expense categories when I get into the personnel and materials and services, and we can talk about that. But yes, to make up for some of the increases with personnel costs that I'm about to go over, you're going to see some reductions in materials and services, and you're also going to see more utilization of beginning balances or balances to offset that. And during the presentations this week, you're also going to see where some departments actually had to do some cost reduction, or they have requests in because they couldn't, they had to make cuts in order to balance their budget.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so this is the current fiscal year, 2021-22. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading my slides wrong, or read my notes wrong. This is actually what we have proposed for the 21-22 budget for major expense categories. As you can see, which is not unusual, personnel represents a large share of those expenses. We have over 600 FTEs here in the county. And so as you can see, personnel costs represent 46.7% of what's in the proposed budget. Materials and services is next, at right around 30%. And then what you'll see is we have been doing what we have budgeted in here is right around 10% in reserves. So this is what we have, a breakdown on. The one little slice that I know sometimes comes up with the question on why is there this 97,000 that's set off separately and it's barely even a sliver on this. Those are the county school funds that were a pass through. So SRS funds from the state or any of those that are county school funds, that's a pass through. It's, I hate to call it out, but it's just kind of why do we have this less than 1% that shows up on this chart? But in case there's questions about that. So and how do we compare to last year's budget? As you can see, personnel costs are up. And again, like Commissioner Burschauer was saying, with the projected increase, it's up around 8%. We started in spring of 2020, so it was during the last budget year, but all of the contracts went into effect this current fiscal year. We were in negotiations on 3 collective bargaining agreements, including our largest collective bargaining agreement with our largest union, which represents, it's our largest union with AFSCME. So we had 3 new CBAs that were effective this current fiscal year. And so we're going to see some increases associated to those collective bargaining agreements. That again, we're going to be seeing a second set of increases under the CBA. It can vary from CBA to CBA. So that's why you're going to see a jump in the total costs, and and it's not just personnel. It also included in the personnel is not necessarily just wages and salaries, but it's also increases in benefit costs. It's also increase in PERS. So it's all those roll-ups are also included in that total number. And then you're going to see where materials and services is down a little bit. And there's 2 things at play. One, I think some departments really sharpen their pencils on the materials and services in order to balance their budget, because we have to present a balanced budget to the budget committee. But also adding to that is if you look at the 2021 under materials and services, that also has the CARES Act funding also included. And so a majority of the CARES Act that we were using was really for materials and services, and all those grants that we provided to the business community and also for specific projects would have come out of a materials and services line. So you don't have the CARES Act, and so it's a combination of factors to where you're going to see personnel going up and then materials and services coming down. And then the same thing goes with the reserve lines. You're going to see that reserve line come down, and a majority of that is one, we've really tried to hold flat on internal charges in going into an insurance reserve, but also with the adoption of the current year budget, we also did a one-time transfer of funds that reduced that overall balance in Fund 80.
Ken, I have a question before you leave this slide. As far as the increase in personnel costs due to the CBAs, do we have a dollar figure on that, which includes roll-ups?
I'm trying to remember if I have a specific slide on that on the actual costs. I can get that information for you. I'm trying to remember. I may have that in a future slide. But otherwise, I can get that information off of one of my spreadsheets that I used for the data on this. I'm nervous about closing this and going into my spreadsheet because I don't know if I'll get my presentation back up again. So
no worries. Thank you.
Ken, on looking at the budget binder on page III, so page 3I. Oh, never mind. Sorry, that was just for one department. Forgive me.
Oh, I'm trying to see because I haven't put this message into the binder. I emailed it to you. So So it sounds like you were looking at a department specific.
That's correct. Sorry about the interruption.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's for criminal justice team. So here's the trend. This is looking back a 10-year trend. As you can see, personnel costs continue to escalate. They go up, and this is a combination of collective bargaining agreements, increased wages, increased personnel costs associated, whether it's with PERS or other benefits that the county pays for. So you're going to see that it has steadily been going up and has gone up pretty drastically over the last couple of years. And keeping in mind that in the previous couple of years, we had a new Teamsters contract, which is with the sheriff's office, which had a number of large increases associated with that contract, and also with FOPO, or no. Yeah, I think it was FOPO was the other one that was adopted prior. And then we had the 3 outstanding CBAs that were all up for renewal and bargained in the last year. The materials and services, again, you're going to see, that went up quite a bit. A lot of that was, again, these are budgeted numbers. You're going to see some increases. Some of that was also associated with the transfers. So it's interesting because with like a Fund 80, that was almost a $2 million transfer that we did out of that. How that's reflected in the budget is it's reflected, not only do you see a reduction in the reserves, but you see an increase in the materials and services because those funds were being transferred as part of the budget. So you're going to see that increase. You're also going to see again, with the CARES Act, that was going to be another one to where you're going to see that uptick. And the other thing I would highlight, and you'll see in later slides when we get to it, for 2021, that is the budgeted number, and 21-22 is the projected number. All of the previous years are actuals. So that's another thing. And when I get later on, you'll see the presentation that the difference between the budget number and the actual number can vary because there's a lot of variables, vacancy savings, project or funds that were planned to be spent on a project may not have been spent. So there is some variables in these numbers. And here's where you can see more of the breakdown on the specifics. This was this new information that we added last year that really wanted to, the previous committees and board had asked for more information around the personnel expenses. And so you can see we of that total number of personnel expenses, 63% of that is salary. Next, it's medical and other benefits, which, we, as part of the total benefit package, which represents about 19% of the personnel costs, and retirement represents 13%. And here's some trends, again, for each of those categories. We have seen salaries going up, and that's a combination of both increase FTEs, because again, this isn't just tied directly to a salary increase. This is also, this is a personnel cost. So it can, while a COLA or a market increase could impact that number, but also additional FTEs could impact that number. Filling vacant positions could also impact that number. The types of positions that departments are creating, that if you are seeing trends to where you're creating more professional level positions within the budget that are at the higher end of the pay scale, that's another item that would drive this number as well. So that's where it gets to be challenging, because you have to be cautious about when you're looking at this. This isn't necessarily just 100% driven by the collective bargaining agreements or any salary increases related to that. It's a combination of factors that drive those costs. As you can see, benefits is another one that has held relatively, we've seen some annual increases associated with that, with the medical benefits. PERS is another one that we're always keeping an eye on, because there's a lot always, it seems like every time we turn around, there's a legislative change with PERS, and we'll see an increase in those rates. And you can see what that trend is going to look like under, for the retirement. Next, I'm going to get into a little more detail about the materials and services. You can see the big part is, more than half of that is what we call services. And, this services can vary from everything from leases, utilities, contract services, professional services, grants that we typically issue. All those items are built into that service line. Materials, it's really specific. It's our, pens and paper and items like that we purchased in order to operate. The other thing that I would highlight under services, where we've seen, on the next slide, you'll see some of the trends to where that's going up. Another big category that I've observed over the years that we've seen steady increases, it's on software licensing. There's software licensing comes out of that services line. And again, we're having to convert and utilize a lot of updated software and software licensing, and that comes at a cost. And so that's another item that really drives this line.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
On the last slide, does it include capital investment type purchases?
No, I'm sorry.
Trucks, longer use items, like you said, materials, pens, papers, and that I understand. But what about larger pieces of equipment or that kind of thing?
We track capital expenditures in a separate line, not in materials and services.
Okay.
And we have a capital line, so anything that costs more than $5,000 and has a lifespan of more than 12 months is a capital expenditure.
Right.
And so we track that in a specific capital line. And I do have some more information coming up on slides on showing those capital lines. And some of the challenges we run into is a lot of times when we're building the budgets, a department may build the appropriation authority for a project in their materials and services, and then come to find out, well, no, this is a capital project, and we'll record the actual expenditure to a capital line. So sometimes there could be some capital that is appropriated in these lines, but it's something we're always working on improving on better projecting those capital projects.
Thank you.
So this is the category trends that you'll see for materials and services. I would highlight under the 2021 budget, you're going to see that increase. A lot of that has to do with the CARES Act funding, because with the community grants, again, we would record that. The expenses associated with those grants would fall into that services category. You can see materials holds pretty flat compared to actuals and what has been built into the budget. The internal charges, you'll see that there's a number of transfers that have been occurring throughout the budget year. And that's why you're going to see that increase. And again, just keeping in mind that for 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, those are actuals, and 2021 is budget, and 2022 is also a proposed budget. So you'll see some discrepancy or some gaps between budget to actual, and that's going to be the next slides I'm about to go through. So the next series of slides that I have, again, this is just to highlight, for your information, and just kind of see the difference between, forecasts and projections and what's built into the budget as a comparison to what we actually see that we receive as far as actuals. Again, I don't have a slide, you know, you're not going to see the current fiscal year on this because the current fiscal year is still ongoing. We haven't closed it yet. So we only have data through 1920 because we've actually closed out 1920 and had an audit that was done. And so you can see with the revenues, 1920 was the first time in quite some time that our revenues actually exceeded what we had budgeted. We typically have a lot of placeholders that are built into the budget. You're going to hear that reference throughout the budget presentations because, again, applying for grants or especially going into a biennium for those departments that rely on intergovernmental, it's a really open-ended, you know, we're trying to do our best with the information we have available in January to try to forecast those revenues. And, you know, so that's 6 months before we see what the actual changes are. And then once we get into the new fiscal year, we receive a grant, we see some cost savings that we didn't project or some of those other items, and then that can drive this number and create some variances. But again, 1920 was one of the first times in a long time to where our actual revenues actually exceeded our budgeted revenues for that year. And then and the same thing goes with projecting expenses. You can see that it's pretty consistent as far as we budget more than we actually end up expending. Again, this is something from a budgetary standpoint. We want to be conservative in our revenue projections, and we want to think about worst case scenario on what our expenses are going to look like. And so you can see that it's been pretty consistent. A lot of times it has to do with vacancy savings. It could be position turnover. It could be, you know, you can realize savings throughout a fiscal year in a number of ways. And at times it also is challenging, like when we were adopting the current year budget, we were in negotiations on 3 contracts. So we were trying to project what those expenses were going to be without necessarily giving away our bargaining position or what we may be working on. You know, so again, trying to forecast what those expenses are going to be. And you can see that we're pretty consistent and that actuals come in typically less than what's budgeted. It'll be interesting to see because I will say that what we built in for personnel costs and budgeted for this year was far less than what was approved with some of the collective bargaining agreements. So I will say that when I do this presentation a year from now, the slide for 2021 is going to look a lot different on the personnel line because I think we've gotten a lot closer to actually what was budgeted. And then, excuse me, and then materials and services, again, you can see typically we build in a lot of placeholders. We want to be conservative. We want to make sure that we have sufficient appropriation authority for the year to be able to spend it, because if we don't appropriate for it, we can't spend the funds. And so we always want to make sure that we have some flexibility during the fiscal year without necessarily coming back and doing multiple supplemental budgets or doing budgetary actions. And also with the materials and services, you're also going to see that, like I was mentioning earlier, that the appropriation for a project or having funds available may have been built in a materials and services where in fact it actually came back as a capital project, so it would have been recorded or as a capital expenditure. And then the other thing I would highlight, because you're especially going to see this when we get into Fund 80, the insurance reserve, that we have some lines where we hold a lot of appropriation because especially in Fund 80, and I can get into more detail on that, but we need to have plenty of funds appropriated for any type of adverse action that may occur, like a liability claim or a lawsuit or some type of payout, to make sure that we have the funds available to spend on that. So there are some lines that you're going to see that are appropriated much higher than what the actuals are going to look like. But just keeping in mind that if we don't appropriate for it, we can't spend it. And so we need to make sure that we have enough flexibility to respond to that. And then this next slide is looking at audited ending balances. Balances are always a discussion as we're looking at budgets. We here at Yamhill County, we do not do a zero balance, meaning if departments, anything that they don't spend gets taken away from the department and then pulled back into the general fund. We actually, over years, and it's something to promote conservative spending and conservative budgeting, departments, they keep their beginning balance and then they use that the following year. Any cost savings they realize in the current fiscal year, they will have that to hopefully reduce the demand on discretionary or other revenue requests that would come up if we did a zero balance. You'll see that over the last 10 plus years, we've seen an increase in those balance numbers. We are seeing it come down a little bit, and I'm projecting, I think we're going to continue to see that we're going to have to utilize more balances, and you're going to see less of an ending balance built into budgets just based on needs. Oop. All right. There, okay. My mouse is kind of tricky here. So for 2021, what you're going to see as a difference, we have this slide just shows what was budgeted for this current fiscal year. The current year that's still open, not the one we're talking about approving, but what was budgeted versus the audited number that came back. And again, some were a positive. We saw less spending than what was projected, or we saw increases in revenue higher than what was projected to close out that year. And so all these numbers are, again, we go through this exercise of when we close out last year and we use those audited beginning balance numbers. And that's the first numbers that we start using when we start building our budgets in individual departments and funds. All right, so the next series of slides that I'm going to go through is how do we compare to other comparable counties? And this is something that we provide, we're required to provide this as part of the Oregon budget law as part of the presentations, but it also gives you a good idea to see, look at our budgeting and spending practices as compared to comparable counties. So how do we compare? So this first slide is we're talking about population growth among comparable counties. It really hasn't changed much over the years as far as the order. We're still in that right around third as third fastest growing over the last 20 years. And so you'll see our comparables. They're all close to us as far as population goes. This next slide, is the per capita spending, revenue and expenses of comparable counties. And so again, when you take that population and you apply that on their audited revenues and expenses, what it looks like we're collecting and spending on a per capita basis. And you can see we're pretty much online with most of our other comparable counties. We're behind Lincoln and Coos and Lynn County, but otherwise we're pretty close or pretty on par with others. I'm sorry, I'm multitasking and I want to make sure I have my notes. So again, last year we were the 4th lowest in expenditure and 4th lowest in revenue. And again, we remain 4th in both those categories. The next slide is comparable counties, the difference between revenue and expense. And so again, this is pulling audited numbers. I do want to put a disclaimer on some of the data that is driving these slides. Columbia and Coos County, we're using older data because they haven't filed their audits with the state yet. So I wasn't able to actually get their audited numbers. And we typically use their audit numbers to review this. So those are old numbers. Historically, they haven't deviated that far from that. So I felt comfortable just including that in order to prepare this slide. But again, the difference between revenue and expense, I definitely want to be on the positive side of this. That means that we're taking in more revenue than our expenses. And so any questions on this slide? All right. So that was our comparison. So now I'm trying to speed up a little bit because I realize I'm cutting into HHS's time on their presentation. So I have 4 slides to go. So I'm going to go pretty quickly on these. So looking ahead, again, these are just some ideas or some items that I just wanted to call out. COVID-19 continues, and that's going to have a budgetary impact. Again, we're still watching revenues and potential impacts to revenues. And then we have some positive impacts to revenues like ARPA and some things like that. State funding, the state hasn't adopted their biennial budget yet. And so as part of the governor's recommended budget, a lot of our departments, I call out in particular, you'll hear more about it when Jessica Beach does her presentation. But community corrections is seeing a legislative cut to what funding they receive for their parole and probation office. Again, I'm seeing increased demands on discretionary revenues. As you can see, we have limited discretionary revenues, and you're going to see a number of requests during this week coming forward. And so again, we continue to see increased demands on general fund. Long-term county facility needs. Last year, we completed a comprehensive space needs analysis because we're really outgrowing a lot of our facilities, and operating in a pandemic has also further highlighted some of the challenges that we have a lot of with our facilities and being able to socially distant and operate when a lot of our offices, like the one I'm sitting in, it's a historic home that was converted into a business office that it was probably great for residential, but wasn't designed for commercial needs. So it does present some challenges. The courthouse is something we're always looking at. The courts have approached the county on several occasions about additional needing an additional courtroom, in particular needing another courtroom to hold jury trials. And I'm anticipating that with the pandemic and the backlog that they have on their docket with all the delays, there'll probably be even more of a demand, because we provide the courthouse for the courts to operate. The courts are independent of the county, but we have to provide the courthouse. So the courthouse is always a challenge. The fairgrounds is one that's been really impacted by the pandemic. They did not hold a fair. They haven't been able to hold a lot of events. They don't receive general fund. They're basically fee revenue driven. And so these close downs, we can't just necessarily just we couldn't just close the fairgrounds down. We still have to maintain it. The buildings still need maintenance. The buildings will still deteriorate. We still have to work on a lot of that. So I think you're going to see as part of that presentation that they're going to be one of the obvious departments that had a direct impact by the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan Act, again, I went over that in detail. New finance system. This is something that we're in the middle of an RFP right now. Our current finance system, GEMS, we've been using, I believe, since 1997. It's had some updates over the years, but it's time we need to replace that central finance system. And anybody who's been involved with an ERP project knows that that's a daunting task, and that's going to be a multi-year project to accomplish. The personnel costs from the slides that you're seeing, you're going to see that we've seen an escalation in the personnel costs really driving the county. And again, it's something we're going to have to continue to monitor and address into the future. I always want to put in my plug about reserves and balances, making sure that we have sufficient reserves and balances that should pandemics or economic issues come up, that we still maintain we have sufficient reserves and balances to at least continue to offer and deliver those critical services that we provide when we see revenues that are being impacted. It is something that I think with conservative budgeting over the last several years, we've been able to absorb some of the impact as a result of the pandemic. But again, it's something that I'm keeping my eye on. And transit has a number of projects. This is one that in the overall budget of things, it's one of the smaller service teams, but we've seen a lot of growth. We have a new transit provider contract that went into effect. There's a lot of funds that come from the state into transit to, again, further develop our transit system. So that's going to be something that is still going to, I just want to highlight that you're going to see some presentations when Cynthia Thompson comes forward and presents her budget. Next slide. This is something that we provide every year for a number of time. It's just looking at PERS rates. I know PERS is always a topic of discussion. And so I have the prior rates, and they do it by the biennium. So the 19 to 21 rates, and then those changes, there were a number of changes that went into effect. And what I'd call out is tier 1 and tier 2 was a pretty small increase, but a lot of the increase you're going to see is that OPSERP, which is the tier 3, where we saw some increases this year. And we transitioned. There was a time where most of our employees were tier 1 or tier 2, but that has really drastically changed. And I want to say it's probably getting closer to 70 to 75% of our employees are OPSERP. And then the remainder are tier 1 or tier 2 or police and fire. And then we still have in Fund 80, we do have a PERS reserve. This is something that we've been contributing to the budget. In previous adopted budgets, there were transfers going into Fund 80, and we continue to have that PERS reserve. If it ever comes to a point that we want to access some of those funds and transfer it back to department to offset the increases that are coming in, we do have these funds that are available. So the good news, like I was just talking about, we have the retirement reserve available. It's at $2.3 million. We continue to see positive with our insurance reserves. A lot of that has to do with the change in our workers' comp carrier a few years ago, and then some changes to our liability plans, where as close to being self-insured as you can get without being fully self-insured. We're on a retro plan. And the benefit is if you have really good risk management and you manage claims and you don't have a lot of claims, we realize a cost savings. The downside is if you do get a substantial claim, you're going to be paying more out of pocket before the insurance company starts paying. There's no deductible. It's an out-of-pocket maximum. Again, we continue conservative budgeting and fiscal management, and I think you'll see that throughout the presentations this week. we have really strong hands-on working managers that work really hard every day and do an outstanding job in not just developing the budget, but implementing the budget throughout the fiscal year. And again, I want to highlight, we have outstanding employees providing services throughout the county. And the county has had a lot thrown at it over the last 12 months, just like the rest of the community in responding to this pandemic. And we have a lot of employees in our public, I just want to call attention to our public health in particular, that are on the front lines responding to this and standing up a lot of contact tracing and testing and vaccine rollout and all of that great work that HHS is doing, and you'll hear more about with the next presentation from Lindsay when she goes over HHS. But again, we wouldn't be able to operate without the employees that we have and continue to deliver the services that we do. And we deliver a wide variety of critical services throughout the community, and we couldn't do that without our outstanding team. And that concludes the budget message and presentation. And I apologize that I ran a little bit long. Sorry, Lindsay. I know I'm cutting into your presentation time. I want to highlight, I just want to recognize the budget team. I didn't do that early on, but our internal budget team, Justin Hogue, who's currently out on parental leave this week, our business services director, he works on all the internal budgets. Mike Barnhart, our finance manager, does an outstanding job. Jennifer Elkins, who is the deputy finance manager, is also instrumental in all these presentations and all these changes and everything that's approved. It's Mike and Jen who then are going to be inputting those into GEMS and making those changes into the budget document and there's a lot of steps involved. And then I also want to put a big shout out and thank you to Carolina and Carrie. They're behind the scenes. They're our support staff. Carrie is the one that's making these Zoom meetings happen. and she's the conductor for the orchestra. And Carolina has to take all my ramblings for the last half hour and put that into concise minutes. So I tip my hat off, I tip my hat to both of them. They both do an outstanding job, and we wouldn't be able to go through this budget process without their hard work and assistance. That being said, that concludes my budget message. Any questions on that?
Just a big thank you to you, Ken. I know it's been long hours, and everybody else that's been working on this. It's just an enormous amount of work. So thank you.
Here, here.
Nice job, guys.
Second that. Thank you.
All right.
So are we looking at maybe still taking a little break or jumping into the next group? I'm thinking we should take a quick break for everybody. Maybe a quick 5 minutes.
It's up
Thank
to
you.
the
All
chair.
right.
Sounds good, Chair.
I don't have a gavel. All right.
Thank you.
Let's we'll begin in about 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Hey, Denny, it's Rick. I thought you said last year you weren't going to be the chairman, so I'm proud that you did it again. You're a willing spirit.
Thank you. Are we all here and ready to go? So we're going to move on to Health and Human Services. And there you are, Lindsay's right there. Good morning.
Good morning. It's nice to see all of you again.
Welcome.
Doreen, to our newest committee member. I'm Lindsay Manfred. I am the Health and Human Services Director and Public Health Administrator. And as of next month, I will have hit my 14th year with the county. So happy to be here presenting our budget to you again this year. Similar to last year, I'm going to start out with just some key administrative and fiscal changes to our current budget, as well as things that we're looking at from an overall perspective in our fiscal year 21-22. We'll then talk about each of our divisions specifically, and then end with a wrap up of threats, opportunities, and just some things that we're keeping close on our radars as we watch the legislative session and various things happening. You have a packet in front of you with various documents that we will reference as we go through them. So I'll call them out as we get to those portions of the budget presentation. And you can see up at the top, they're labeled A through G. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. Please let me know if you have any questions. So just as a reminder, to get us started here, 96% of our budget is state and federal funds, the other 4% being our county general funds. The majority of that 96%, about 3/4, is our Medicaid funding for medically necessary behavioral health services. We have continued to not see any reductions in the Affordable Care Act, which has been great, although we have continued to see a pretty significant increase in our state match, upwards of 10%. And of course, we're still watching what's going to happen with the legislative session that's currently in process to see how that may impact the various components of our budget throughout the HHS department. There are specifically several things happening in this session that we're watching very closely. One of them is related to public health modernization funding, our community or certified community behavioral health CCBHC funding, as well as a bill around mobile crisis that could impact us in a positive way if that continues to move through. We do have a variety of county administrated programs that fall under our CCO global budget. Locally for this is for us, that's our local 501c3 Yamhill Community Care Organization. We have a contract for them to provide the safety net behavioral health services for their 30,000 plus members that are currently within that CCO. And just a reminder, I reminded y'all last year, but the CCO did take back risk for the contract. So that did impact our budget. Currently, we're budgeted to spend approximately 1.4 of our carryover from the 2021 budget, but expect to only spend about 1.3 million of that. And that's largely due to vacancy savings. We anticipate ending 2021 with $6.4 million. And I heard Ken mention this as well. These budgets are, of course, built in January and February, and certainly with a budget like ours that has a lot of impacts through the legislative session, as well as variable revenue forecasting that happens. Of course, we'll be continuing to update this throughout the spring and getting that even closer to what those projections will be for the DOP budget. Our strategy, like every year, has just been a pragmatic use of our fund balance. We are estimating we're estimating to use a balance of 3.9 million this year that is largely going to cover our personnel costs. The changes to our personnel costs, which includes medical, PERS, CBA adjustments, resulted in a 12% increase in salaries and 18% increase of budgeted benefits that cost over 2021 fiscal year, resulting in approximately $4 million that we absorbed. Additionally, based on what we saw for how we believe COVID-19 impacted our revenue, we are estimating that we have experienced a $1.4 million of revenue loss related to our variable revenue. So a couple of pretty significant budget implications for us there that we are managing through and absorbing. On a positive note, from a budget perspective, we have seen OHP membership increase. However, one of those reasons is because WIVICH, if those of you who remember, it was a Marion Polk CCO closed, and that resulted in 2,290 additional YCCO members. Unfortunately, job losses related to COVID-19 also impacted this number. But one of the things that OHA did was put together a waiver that allowed CCOs to go over the amount that they were limited to have for CCO membership. So initially, Yamhill CCO was capped at 28,778 members, but with the waiver, they've actually increased, and now currently YCCO has 30,555 members. We're using the Oregon Health Authority's regional fall 2020 data to forecast membership. And what that's showing right now is a pretty conservative 1% loss. Of course, we're going to be continuing to project this and refine those forecasting as we move through this spring and get a better sense of what that will look like. You can see in item A, the first item in your packet, the overall OHP membership over the course of the last several years. So our 2021 now budget reflects 304.54 FTE. Our proposed budget in front of you has 307.64 FTE. And you can see items B and C for some more information about those things. We do have a few new positions that I will go through and share more about in detail as we go through the specific division that they are attached to. So we'll talk more about what those positions are, but you can see it's a pretty conservative jump for an organization of our size. So I will talk about the reclassifications now just as a whole. We do have 4.0 FTE of HS associate, which is line 406.20, to HS specialist 406.22 in adult behavioral health. This is really related to our peer assisted crisis house and just increased responsibility that those folks have in providing care for some of our highest risk individuals that are in our care. We also have another 4 FTE reclassified from an HS Spec 2 to an HS Spec 3. These are individuals who have been getting lead pay sometime through this last fiscal year because they've done one of two things. Either they've become licensed as a mental health therapist, or they become duly credentialed, meaning that they're able to provide both mental health services as well as alcohol and drug or substance use disorder treatment. Few years ago, we put this in place as a way to help retain employees once they reach licensure, as well as a way to help incentivize getting folks duly credentialed, which we know just provides a much more comprehensive and integrated service. So it's been working really well for us. We also have a reclassification of 1 FTE of HS associate in line 406.20 to HS specialist in our enhanced residential and outreach program. I'll mention a little bit more about that once we get to that overall enhanced residential budget there. Overall operating budget is $43.2 million in the 21-22 commissioner's budget. That's without the potential for new state and federal grant dollars. We actually have an overall $47.9 million of expense authority. And this is really what allows us to bring in new grants, bring in new funding streams, and allow us to be able to accept those things. Of course, working with the Board of Commissioners and County Admin to go through those approval processes as we go through them throughout the year.
Lindsay, if I could jump in, sorry to interrupt really quick, because I just want to make sure that I explain, especially for our newest budget committee member. You're going to hear throughout the week a number of requests and reclassification requests and items like that, like Lindsay had just talked about. During the process, I will be tracking those requests, and I put together what's called a budget committee deliberation list that on Wednesday, I will, once we get through all the presentations, I'll have that finalized list and I will share it with all of you. And then it just helps kind of frame all of the various requests that are going to be brought forward during this week. So I just want to make sure you're aware that you don't have to necessarily keep your own notes or kind of track on okay, what was being requested and when we act on it. So then once we get into the budget and they give more details on that, on Wednesday, I will have that deliberation list that then we'll go line by line, taking actions on each of those items. So I track that for you. So sorry for the
Thank you.
interruption, Nancy.
That's great. Thanks, Ken. So if you want to take a peek at items D and E, this is just an overall historical analysis of how we have used our general fund that comes to us. Remember, that's about 4% of our overall budget. So I don't know if folks have any questions on this. I'm happy to. It's really just more of a reference document so you can see how we've utilized those funds over the course of the last several years. Similar to other budget years, this is a budget where we plan to make mid-year adjustments as needed, of course, working closely with Ken and our full board as those needs arise or opportunities arise to be able to make any of those modifications. Are there any questions before we jump into our division-specific budgets? Oh, looks like we're good. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with our public health division. That is starting on page 3, I believe, of your budget. So this public health position I always like to take this opportunity to share our management and leadership staff who are here, and typically in more regular non-COVID budgets. We have the management team is with me and they can help answer any questions, or certainly it's just nice for them to be able to be recognized. But this year, of course, similar to last year, they're not with us. Sadly, our public health manager position is currently vacant, although I have been the public health administrator for several years and continue that role even when we have a public health manager. So I'm continuing to help support the team in her absence, or in that position's absence. We have our restaurant license fees will show up there on line 321.01. Initially, we held those flat for 2021, but we know just based on the totality of everything that's happening, we're of course analyzing that, and we'll continue to do another analysis and get a firmer projection before they adopt budget as well. Our variable revenue report suggests that our client pay is down by about 3,000, and our private insurance, which is line 346.11, is down by about 11,000. We have one personnel change in this division. Mid-year in 2021, we moved an office specialist 2, which is 402.02 from public health to our adult behavioral health division. This is reflected in the 21-22 budget and reflects a decrease in this overall, the public health division because of that. On line contract services line 611.02, you will see this that pops up. Actually, it's across HHS, but it pops up in public health first, but you'll see it throughout the divisions. It's a contract line for our digitized health records and that process, as well as Relias, which is where we house our policies, procedures, and all of our mandatory training that staff are required to do. Another line, 695.13, that also goes throughout the HHS budget, but shows up first in public health, is licensing fees. Another way that we are working to support our staff and hopefully increase longevity with us and retention. HHS did put in place recently a policy that allowed us to pay up to a certain amount of license fees for our employees. So many of our employees require licensing either as nurses, behavioral health specialists, alcohol and drug counselors, and things, and up to a certain amount we'll be able to reimburse them for that on an annual basis. We continue to manage the COVID-19 pandemic response. We have included COVID-19 direct expenses on line 699.01, as well as we created a new project code in this division called Pandemic Response, which we'll use to continue to refine our state and federal reporting related to the dollars that are coming to us for assistance to respond. As we learn more about the Oregon Health Authority funds that will come into 21-22 budget, we will certainly revise the forecast and have that reflected in the adopt budget. We know that there are additional funds coming, but we're still in the process of analyzing how those funds can be spent and how best to utilize them here locally. This is, of course, a division that's been working very hard over the course of the last year, has really changed the way that we've done a lot of work, and I think is one of those divisions that a couple of years ago most folks didn't really realize even existed, but of course now folks know at least a portion of what we do. I do want to just take a quick moment to say, COVID-19 has been certainly a dominant thing that public health is doing, but I just want to say that public health is doing work every single day, even when it's not COVID related, and has been for decades and decades. And it does public safety work every single day. So even in non-pandemic responses, and it's always nice to be able to remind people of that. Are there any questions about our public health division's budget?
Lindsay, hi, it's Mary, and once again, thank you for all your hard work. I know you haven't had much time off in the last year, and thanks to your team. Question just overall about in other words, balancing what you have received in terms of COVID funds, whether it's reimbursement or anything specific into public health, and what that looks like as far as your overall budget.
So initially, we received CARES Act funding, and the majority of the CARES Act funding was initially required to be spent by the end of December. There was a little bit of time that was allowed to carry over sort of at the last minute. We had expended that funding, so we had used all of that largely for ramping up our contact tracing and case investigation process that happened in August. Sort of March through August, we've been able to maintain majority of the work by absorbing through our existing staff. And then August happened, and that was sort of the first surge that we saw. And we really did need to increase staffing substantially to be able to manage the demands on the team, which include providing 7 days a week coverage to do case investigation, contact tracing, disease outbreak investigation, testing, all of those types of things. So that the vast majority of the money went towards that, as well as wraparound supports to be able to provide concrete things like assisting with rent or mortgages or food, delivering food, things of that nature, that we were able to use those funds for individuals who were quarantined and not able to go to work or not able to go to the grocery store and purchase food. Later on in the fall, the state did begin contracting directly with community-based organizations. And so some of that shifted to them, which was welcomed and great. And we work really closely with those organizations. The existing funding that is coming in now, we're still in process of analyzing how much that can be used and for what. And so don't have strong figures or hard figures on that yet, as we are just now getting those sort of announcements around those things currently. Did that answer your question, Commissioner?
Yes, thank you very much.
Any other public health division questions? Okay. Well, then I will move on to our next division, our Veterans and Developmental Disabilities Services. Our Veterans program is led by Christina Ferguson, and our DD program is currently being led by Chelsea Randall. Our focus right now for our Veterans program is really around our peer support grant. The grant from the Oregon Health Authority ends on 6/30 of this year. And with the unfortunate passing of Ed Howard, who filled that role with us last winter, we're currently exploring what we want to do with that role, with some, around braided funding and how it's going to be integrated throughout HHS. And so there's still a lot of discussion happening because we're in the early phases of doing that work, both with the state and with local partners. However, we do have it currently budgeted in its existence as it has been historically in the budget. Additionally, it's worth noting that the funding for our Veteran Services officers remains largely flat from the Oregon Veterans Department, while our personnel costs are significantly increasing. And so we are really needing to make additional investment with County General Fund into that program in an effort to keep it whole. For our developmental disabilities program, we do have one additional senior accounting clerk position that we've added to the budget. That's line 402.14. This is really addressing our increased program growth and caseload growth that's supported by the DHS caseload forecasts for our team here. This FTE actually existed in the 1920 adopt budget as an accounting clerk too, but then was removed as we were feeling very uncertain of where we were at with our budget last year around this time. However, now that we have had some stabilization and just again, based on those evolving needs, and sometimes when you remove something from a budget, you can tell you really need it, we have decided to add it back this year. And yes, Ken.
And before we get too far, because I also want to, again, and just as a reminder for our budget committee members and for our newest member, that a lot of times the line that Lindsay was referring to, which we typically talk about 402.14, it was a line. Those are the last 5 digits. If you look at the very center column and just kind of budget 101, I'm just back a little bit. You have fund, the GL line number, it's 16-71-402.14. The Fund 16 is the department, Fund 71 is the division, and the 402.14 is the type code for that specific expenditure. And just so everybody's able to find it in the budget document, because I know sometimes when you throw out a line 402.14 and then you're scrambling looking for that number within the document, I just wanted to take a second just to, because a lot of times internally we just talk about the type codes. But just I just wanted to give a quick budget 101 on that. So anytime you hear somebody refer to like a 402.14, that's the last 5 digits in that line. So the specific line she was talking about, it's 16-71-402.14. So sorry,
Thanks
Lindsay.
again. No, thank you. I'm relieved. I thought you were going to say that my line numbers weren't matching up with yours. Phew. Great, thank you. So any questions about either the Veteran Services budget or our Developmental Disabilities budget? Okay, then we will jump into our next division, which is our Community Support Services. This is 16-073, should start on about page 9 for you. This is led by Emily Frey as the manager there. Overall, this program is really stable with very minimal changes. Our private insurance line, which is 34611, decreased slightly due to some revised variable revenue forecasting, but no personnel changes. So that's really all in that one. Our next one is Family and Youth Division, which is 16-075, page 12. That's led by Zoe Pearson in McMinnville and Tiffany Wright in Newburgh. Just as a reminder, last year we did change up some of our divisions, including creating a Newburgh division specifically for Newburgh. Those services have grown, and we really felt that it was worthwhile just to acknowledge that it is operating as its own clinic up there, and we really wanted to make sure that we could provide the services out there, but also the connection with the community out there that we know is needed. And so that change was in an effort to reflect that. And it's why we have 2 managers that you see reflected in some of our behavioral health divisions. Overall, this program is also stable with very minimal changes. We do have state grant and Medicaid funds that have been held relatively flat. Our private insurance line, which is 346.11, did decrease by about $40,000 due to our updated variable revenue forecasts. And really, despite the challenges and the multiple ways our schools have been functioning over the course of the last year, I will say that our school relationships continue to thrive with our behavioral health and public health divisions, probably stronger now more than they have ever been. But we continue to hold those contracts with the schools. The schools have all indicated that they continue to value those contracts and want to maintain those contracts. And we have and currently have our staff are at the school sites as they exist currently. So we've been proud that those have maintained steady and if nothing else have even grown and improved. We did not have any personnel changes in the family and youth budget. Okay. Next division is our administrative division led by Christina Ferguson. This is 16-079 on page 15. So, sorry, folks. So within the state grant line, 334.11, the majority of expense authority for really potential for new state programs, but it also contains 129,000 in our state grant line for fee-for-service payments to hospitals for our indigent population. We didn't have any personnel changes in this budget. We do have a decreased community provider. You'll see the decreased community provider contracts on line 613.04 from 4.3 million in the 2021 budget to 3.3 million in 21-22. And this is really related to the changes in our contractual requirements and needs from our CCO. As they've transitioned the risk and transitioned additional administrative functions, some of that has shifted and changed, and that's how you're seeing that reflected. You can see that on our item F. Yeah, so if you want to look at that, you can see in over time how that looks and how that's been adjusting. We are also working closely with our CCO to understand the CCO 2.0 obligations in terms of compliance and how that's going to impact what we need to do on our end. We're also continuing to go through a process of transition with our CCO, and there's still a lot of work happening related to administrative functions that HHS has largely held that may be moving back to the CCO. Some of those have, and others have remained with us. And so we're continuing to go through that process, and we'll have a better sense of that in the coming months of how that may impact what we're doing, and of course, how that impacts our budget. We held the OHP expansion line, which is 720.21 flat, again, due to that projected 1% decrease in OHP membership that I mentioned earlier today. And we continue to budget 1.25 million in new state grants. You'll see that in line 720.11, which is that money or that sort of in and out space that I mentioned earlier that allows us to go for and bring in additional dollars through grants and other funding sources as opportunities become available.
Lindsay, this is Rick. Just a quick question. With unemployment dropping in the county to, I think, 5.8, whatever, what are you forecasting for the next biennium in terms of enrollment or disenrollment into employer paid?
Well, at this point, I mean, for OHP, you know, is really what we're looking at. The existing forecasting shows a 1% decrease, although we are really working to make sure that that forecast is accurate, and we'll do that again later on in the spring. I'm going to pause real quick though and see if our fiscal manager has anything she'd like to add. Do you want? Carrie, do you mind putting Christina on? She's in the waiting room.
Thank you, Carrie. Good morning, everybody. Chair, I would just add that our 1% membership loss is actually, it's conservative. It's in line with some of the practices that Ken was saying that we try to strive to for our overall budget. And the other thing that is in play is that Oregon Health Authority only extended that open contract period, allowing CCOs to take on members above their contract cap through June 30th. And so really that last half from 7/1 of 2021 through the end of the calendar year is unknown. They may actually go through a round of redeterminations, which may decrease that membership lightly. So really what we've done is be conservative in our revenue projections for the coming year so that we don't get into a place where, because of our increased personnel costs, that we end up not having enough risk reserve to cover that liability and those expenses. So hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. One other thing you'll see in the administrative budget is we do have budgeting a new cost of virtual blades for Raintree, which is our electronic health record system, on GL line 801.04. This is an amount of $25,000. And this really was a recommendation from our IT department head, Shane Hoffman. Any additional questions about our admin budget? Okay, great. Well, we'll move on to our enhanced residential and outreach. That is 16-172 on page 20. And this division is really led by Chris Pendleton. Like many of the other ones, pretty stable here with minimal changes. Our private insurance line, 346.11, and public insurance line, 346.12, increased due to updated variable revenue forecasts. And this is one of those divisions where we do have a reclassification of one FTE from health services associate to a specialist 1. And that's really to support increased responsibilities associated with that role working in that division there. Next up, we have housing and recovery supports, 16-173 on page 23. This division is led by Callie Gamble. This was also one of the divisions that last year we carved out, really because it has been an area that has grown significantly over the course of the last few years, very intentionally, I should add. What falls under this is our transitional treatment recovery service homes, rental assistance programs, supported and supportive housing programs that include all of our master lease facilities, as well as Bridges, Homeport, and Sunnyside, which are, as well as some other scattered sites throughout our community. And this division revenue is largely state grant funds. That's line 334.11, which amounts to $6,553. And then we have 1.2 million in public insurance, line 34612, as well as local GHS contracts that make up about 312,000 of this budget. That can be found on line 346.13. We do have one personnel change to this program. We are requesting to add one FTE of program supervisor. This actually shows up as a program manager on line 401.37. This need and this change is really resulting in the Sheridan Housing Project and the increased need for supports to be able to operate these intensive in-home services and manage those programs. We do have the new master lease program and facility in Sheridan. We have the previous ones on Bakersfield as well as Aspen Ridge that do generate rental income. That's what you'll see on line 362.04, which is estimated on about an 85% occupancy rate. You'll see if you didn't see it, 611.30 is where you'll find that. Our Sheridan project was delayed in 2021, and so we did have to make adjustments to what we were anticipating collecting in terms of rental assistance. And although it was delayed, I'm excited to share that they did break ground this winter and anticipate the first half of the units to be complete and people to be able to move in towards the end of summer. So there's a lot of work happening right now with this exciting project and that division, working with the community, working with the older adult community that's next door, doing a lot of planning around exactly what that program is going to look like in partnership with our housing authority and other partners. So we're really excited for that, and I think it's going to be a tremendous value for our community. So we'll definitely be coming back to share more updates with our board as things progress there. Our next division here, actually the last division, is our adult behavioral health, which is line 16-174 on page 26. This is led by Raina Cole and Bethany Ball in McMinnville, as well as Tiffany Wright in our Newburgh clinic. Our state health grant, line 334.11, was held flat. And does not include any potential new revenue forecasting. Public health insurance, our OHP, line 34612, increased revenue allocation due to utilization of our medication-assisted treatment program, which we have continued to evolve and increase. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later on when I mentioned impacts related to Measure 110. Couple of personnel changes to note. Again, these are all reflected in item B and C in your packet as well. But there's a reclassification of the 4 FTE HS associates to HS specialists due to increased responsibilities associated with that peer-assisted crisis work and the work that they do with those populations. And then the reclassification of the 4 FTE of HS Spec 2s to Spec 3s for those who either became licensed or duly credentialed over the course of this last year. Are there any questions around our division-specific budgets? Okay. Yes, Commissioner Berschauer.
Thanks, Lindsay. So now correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm looking at the special COVID related pandemic expenses, and it looks like we're, let's see, roughly $266,000 year to date. Does that sound about right? In additional expenses?
I don't think so. Can you,
Okay.
which line are we? I want to go back and make sure that I can answer your question though.
So there's in each budget, there's an other expense, and then it's
Oh, sure.
specific to COVID-19 pandemic expenses. And year to date, it's roughly 266, but then going forward, the budgeted is like 243. So I'm trying to wrap my head around what that is, what it's been year to date, and what it's, why it's similar going forward for the next fiscal year.
Okay. I think what is missing from that is the direct expenses from our public health budget that's expensing against that, right? Which is the majority of those funds. It's tracked in a couple of places.
Okay.
For that.
Is there a location where those totals are aggregated?
We not in front of you right now, but certainly we have that and are happy to reflect that if that's something that there's, if you want more information about that.
No, just hoping to follow along a little better in the conversation. Thank you.
Got it. Yeah, I'm just, Christina, is there something else that you'd like to share just since you're on here?
Sure. I'd say that we have revised our methodology for reporting over the course of the last year. And so what you see in each division on that 699.01 line is the non-public health related costs of responding to the COVID pandemic. And we track those separately in our other divisions so that we could keep separate the public health cost for contact tracing, for standing up our vaccine clinics and all of those things. So that is tracked separately in the public health budget under a specific project, H004. So within H004 itself, that's where you'll see the lion's share, if you will, of all of our pandemic response costs. And we track that in a very complex spreadsheet, as you might imagine, with all of those different funding streams that come through, both from the CARES Act and then from the state as well, in our public health expense report, which is really breaks apart into each individual grant line within public health, what those expenses look like. As Lindsay was saying earlier, we also are going through some of the newer funding streams that are set to come our way and decide how we want to budget those for the coming year, what that will look like, and what those costs will cover. And so, Commissioner Bershauer, you are absolutely correct to look at that 69901 as a portion of our COVID response, but it's also embedded into a specific project in Division 070.
Thank you. So I'm curious, is it a situation where we are now expecting that to go forward, and for how long? Or is this something where we're trying to sort of be made whole on past expenses over the past year? I'm just unclear as to if we're building it into the budgets, you know, is this going to continue into 22, 23, et cetera, or how is that going to play out?
Well, gosh, my hope is no, that we will not be continuing our COVID-19 pandemic response into 2022. I think our director and public health administrator would agree with me on that front. What we've tried to do in this earlier budget that was again created back in January of this year is really to take an attempt to represent some of the increased costs that we're seeing in our non-public health divisions related to our COVID pandemic. And some of those are around, you know, the purchase of PPE and some of the OSHA requirements for our workplaces and things of that nature. So what I would say is that we are in the process right now of adapting those forecasts, and I would hope very much that we're leading toward decreasing those costs in our other divisions over time as more and more people in our county are vaccinated, and that we kind of shift our focus from managing a pandemic to really getting back to a new sense of normal.
Yeah. Thanks, Christina. And yes, I would agree. I really hope that this is not where we're at in when I'm talking with you all this time next year, for sure. Anything, you know, Christina mentioned that while the bulk of the COVID expenses have of course landed in our public health budget, there have been expenses throughout HHS, just like every other department has had COVID related expenses that have come down for the various things with OSHA requirements, PPE, and just changes in how we've had to do work. For us, a huge piece of that was around telehealth, assuring that we got equipment out, assuring that our not only staff had support, but also our clients had the supports that they needed to be able to engage in their services, to make sure that none of that went away. So definitely feeling that across the board at HHS, even though, like I said, the bulk of that is going to be there. And you know, I think right now, myself, as well as public health administrators around the state, are really trying to understand, forecast, project, and make sense of what we think will be happening in the coming months, right? It's a little bit of a guessing game, and there's a lot of unknowns. We know that there will always be some level of COVID response, but we anticipate it not being anything as significant as what we're seeing right now, and that it will instead be folded into our general disease response, right? Because communicable disease is not anything new to our public health division. It's usually just not so wide sweeping, and it's usually not quite so public, but we definitely have that communicable disease team that has consistently responds to E. coli and Salmonella, botulism, all sorts of things that we do on a daily basis. And then the other thing that we know is going to continue to be with us in a good way is telehealth, right? I think HHS was just beginning to explore telehealth early on, quite honestly, last February, trying to dip our toes in the water, making sure that we understood the Medicaid and billing rules around telehealth, because we know that there's a population of people that are served very well through telehealth and might engage in behavioral health services that they wouldn't normally do if they couldn't do it from their own home and their own space. So we were really looking at that. Of course, we got thrust into that, sort of head over heels, if you will, and had to learn a lot really quickly. But one thing that we did learn is that there are, just like we anticipated, some populations that are served very well through telehealth. And we want to assure that whatever we put in place continues to be able to meet that need in the community and serve that. But that is an ongoing cost for us to help understand and to make sure that that we're ready for that through our EHR system, being able to manage that, and all of the other pieces you can imagine that go along with that.
Ken?
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you, Lindsay, for that information. The other thing that I would just add, again, when you're looking at the budgetary document, the one thing from a presentation standpoint, when you're looking at these lines, you're looking at a variety of projects that could be rolled up into that individual line amount. So when you're looking for a specific line related to COVID or pandemic, it might be part of that number, much like, and we use a lot of project codes and a lot of tracking and a lot of things that is done separately outside of the budget document, but through the finance system. And then also with how complicated and HHS and their revenue streams and the reporting requirements and everything they do have some robust independent systems that a lot of our other departments don't have for tracking a lot of those expenditures in order to do the billing. And so I just wanted to highlight that there's some limitations in the budget document for kind of extrapolating some data related to pandemic response, because and you'll see it throughout the budget, but a lot of departments, you're really just going to see a reimbursement line to where you're going to see those funds being recorded as a revenue. And more than likely, those were CARES Act funds that were received, and they're recorded to a reimbursement line. In our system, it's going to be a reimbursement plus a project code that we use internally called CV19 that we use to track for reporting and things like that. And so I just wanted to highlight that at times, with the budget document, what we're trying to do is you have a really good indication at looking at year-to-date actuals and adopted budget, keeping in mind that we didn't adopt any placeholders for pandemic response things into the current year budget. So you're not going to see specific placeholders in there except for as part of the supplemental budget. And then moving forward, what we're trying to do is make sure that, projecting out on and making sure we have appropriation should funding come available or be made available, because there's a lot of decisions on like the ARPA funds in particular. While we know we have those funds coming, there's still discussions to be had with the board on policies and guidelines on what's going to be made available for various programs and internal expenses. And so even that's not really incorporated into this budget, except for some placeholders of some potential revenues. So I just wanted to share, just from a presentation standpoint, when you're looking at the budget, they added some placeholders and some notes on those on some anticipated pandemic response lines, but that's really to hold appropriation. And I know Christina and Lindsay do a really nice job with their budget, but there's also, I just wanted to highlight some of the limitations on because until you start seeing the audit and you start getting into the audit documents and you start getting into seeing the project codes, having seen what we called Mullins for a lot of HHS employees, you see a line for 50,000, but then when you see it in our system, that 50,000 is subdivided by like 20 project codes that they use for tracking within the system to the various program elements. And so how that all derives up, and what you're seeing in the budget document is a rolled up number of all of those various projects in that.
I have a question. I'm wondering, just to go back to that one earlier, Lindsay, this would be, will we have, or will be able to have sort of that aggregate number of what COVID response cost, and then as compared to what we received in any capacity, in any pots of money, to address that, so that we have those two separate numbers?
Yes, that is information that we have, certainly. And if that's of interest to have more details on that, we can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, there's stuff that we all track. We've got it with us, not just here present for you today in a handout form, but it's all information that we are tracking closely and reporting to the state on regular basis on how those funds are being expended. For sure.
And one more question. I know that when we had to ramp up for increased personnel for contact tracing, how did that impact the overall FTEs? And there were some people who were hired on a temporary basis. So how is that shaking out?
Yeah, sure. So overall, we hired a total of, I can't tell you the FTE, although Christina, you may have it, but it's 12 people. So sometimes our budget talks in terms of FTE, but of course, when I'm thinking of our team, I think in terms of people. So it's 12 people that have been hired, but not the majority of them are working on a part-time basis. All of them at this point are temporary. So there's some that just work on weekends and others that do work full-time with us. And their time is really split between, I would say, 3 things: contact tracing and in case investigation, vaccine rollout, and our wraparound support. So coordinating to make sure that anyone in quarantine is able to get access to rent or mortgage assistance, food assistance, and those types of things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a quick follow-up question. So, and I'm not tracking the latest on OSHA and the potentially permanent rules, but if they do decide to do that, how do you see that impacting your budget?
Can you mention which permanent rules? Are you talking about the contact tracing case investigation components around the Oregon Health Authority, or around some of OSHA's requirements related to masking and whatnot?
Kind of all of it: masking, social distancing, and then the enforcement of such, and then some of the other stuff too.
Yeah, well, I think from an HHS perspective, any requirements around continued retirement requirements or permanent requirements around distancing certainly puts a strain on building capacity in some of our divisions specifically. One of them I will call out, coincidentally, is our public health building. So that one is one where we literally cannot have all of our staff. So the majority of our temporary staff are working offsite, or we have a combination of, we have some staff where they can really fully function offsite. And so they are there so that our call center staff and some of those temp hires can be on site where there's more fluctuation in the knowledge base and things that they have to be there. So certainly I would think space capacity would be our biggest challenge that we would need to account for should those rules be permanent. With the Oregon Health Authority, as far as overall maintenance of COVID response, I think there's going to be a couple of things that happen. One, yes, I assume that COVID-19 will continue to be a reportable disease for the foreseeable future. There may be shifts in what that reporting looks like to be more in line with other respiratory illnesses that we see, but we don't know exactly what that will be. And that really, in general, what that means and what we would anticipate potentially changing is the amount of time in which we have to begin our case investigation. Currently, that it exists as we have to do that within 24 hours, we have to begin that investigation. And so if that continues, where we are doing that, that may need more regular changes in our communicable disease staff to maintain 7-day capacity. But of course, what we also are all desperately hoping for is that we see those case numbers go down significantly over the course of the coming months, so that it won't be such a strain, even if that requirement still exists. So COVID-19 is not the only illness, right, that we have to follow up on for within 24 hours. We have several illnesses in the community that we are required, it's Public Health Authority, things like meningococcal, for example, that if we get a case of that, as soon as we find out, we need to begin an investigation within 24 hours, again, just because of the safety needs and the desire to move quickly to provide prophylaxis or anything else that needs to happen in those situations. So hopefully with the decreased count that we all hope to see in months, we will be able to absorb again back into our regular system, which is we have a 24/7 phone for public health. It's been in existence for many years, actually since 2001 is when public health began requiring that as a actual federal requirement. And so we've had that in place for a number of years. And so if anything happens in middle of the night or over the weekends, we can respond that way. But I think it's all going to depend on what our case numbers do, and of course any decisions that OHA makes.
I have a question to follow up on that, Lindsay. As far as if these become, the OSHA rules become permanent, do you anticipate or have you heard of any additional funding that would be coming from the state to help with public health or HHS in general to mitigate those additional costs?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, of course, the ARPA funds are, possibilities. And I think some of those funds, as you all know, are coming directly to cities and counties. And then some of those funds are coming directly to the state that they're rolling out through our program elements directly for public health. So we have that funding stream. There is one CDC funding stream that actually we can use over that's coming to us specifically for COVID, but can be used over the course of 3 years. And so that's one that we're trying to analyze and understand and make some projections about how much we're spending. So that's one. And then the other thing that I would highlight is currently in before the legislature is the public health modernization bill. And while this is not directly tied to COVID-19, I think what the modernization of public health is really trying to do is to help build our infrastructure, especially at a local level, to assure that we have resources that we need that have been really underfunded for the course of many decades. And it's left the infrastructure of public health sort of bare bones. And we know that if we want to be able to respond either to COVID or to other things, that we need to have those pieces built in. Those are things like epidemiology capacity, communications capacity, things like that we don't actually get funded through the Oregon Health Authority or the CDC, because the funds that we receive are so narrowly scoped, and therefore very rigid and specific things. It doesn't allow us to build that capacity. And so the modernization funding is really, of course, we'll have it tied to outcomes and metrics and things that are really important to the community and to the state and to the legislature, but it really is helping provide that foundation so that we can use those funds. The legislature in the last biennium did allocate some modernization funds, and if you all remember, we used that locally to increase our data capacity by hiring an epidemiologist. I will say at the time we had all sorts of really great plans, and we're really excited for how we were going to be using the epidemiology capacity. Of course, about immediately after that individual was hired, COVID hit, and of course, that person was doing far different things than we had imagined, but I can tell you that I have been incredibly grateful to have that person on our team. We have, as you could imagine, many requests for data, local data, things that you all as commissioners and public leaders and our community members want, need, and really should have access to. But if we did not have that position right now, I would not have been able to give you any of that. So that's just one example of that public health infrastructure that was really lacking prior to the modernization funds, but we had now, and we were able to really use them to, I think, our community's benefit throughout this pandemic. And so we're looking for the legislature to really continue to invest in public health and invest in public health modernization so that we can just keep building the scaffolding around that infrastructure to make sure that we can, respond and report out anything that's needed to our community.
Thank you. Ken, would this be something we could keep track of countywide in all our departments and consider it being an unfunded mandate if these rules become permanent? Because they're significant in terms of space issues and telework and on all of that. And there has to be a certain percentage in order for us to be able to do that.
Yes, Commissioner. And I think because it can vary depending on just like the county, same thing like every business in the community with these OSHA regulations and complying with this and trying to limit and prevent outbreaks within office places and everything that has occurred over the last year. The easy one to kind of identify when I look back is really what we've submitted for CARES Act reimbursement is a really good indication, because that has included everything from the purchase of PPE to facility improvements, installing plexiglass, purchasing licensing for Zoom platforms, virtual meeting you know, a lot of things that we did not have in place prior to March of 2020. So we have a variety of things because I think some of the challenges it gets into is a lot of the OSHA requirements. One, we've been dealing with a number of changes since March of 2020 that weren't necessarily tied to the OSHA rules. Eventually it got pulled into the temporary rules, but we were going off CDC guidelines, OHA guidelines. So there was a lot of things that we had to implement. And then there was the federal leaves expansion that we had to cover, that we had to make available for paid leaves and to cover absences for employees. And so, you know, over the last year, we utilized, you know, a portion of our CARES Act reimbursement to offset those costs, to purchase the equipment, to purchase be able to check temperatures coming into buildings, to facilities has been spending a lot of time on disinfecting, you know, something that prior to March 2020, we weren't paying janitorial contractors and our own internal staff to do multiple disinfections of buildings like we're doing right now. You know, so we have some of that we are tracking, but there's also some unknown because like I was saying during my presentation, there's a lot of question marks about our facilities that were really highlighted, that how do we kind of roll that in? Because I do recognize that, I mean, we brought up public health. Public health there's limitations on that building to be able to have everyone in that building doing you know, so they have to look at alternative means to have, you know, some folks on site, some folks off site, and being able to navigate that. And I think that's going to be a larger discussion countywide as well, because I think we have a lot of facilities and buildings that are really limited in the ability to spread people out. And also keeping in mind that when you're dealing with a pandemic, it's kind of contrary to industry trends. I think most new commercial buildings, historically, everybody's going open floor plans and have more flexibility with cubicles. Well, you can't have that in a pandemic. It's almost the opposite, and to where you have to have more individual offices. So it can vary to a certain degree. I think it's something that I'm working with all department heads in not only tracking, because we are tracking our COVID related expenditures, at least the ones that are easy to, you know, direct COVID response. Sometimes it's hard when you start getting into tracking salaries for somebody who's, you know, like a sheriff's deputy, who's working in the jail, and the additional requirements that they're having to do for when they have an adult in custody, and making sure that the, you know, disinfectant and wiping things down. There's that kind of that unwritten cost that's really hard to track, that I think we're all having to do as a best practice. Like something as simple as using the copy machine and having to wipe it down and spend that time to do that. We're not able to necessarily boil down our data collection down to that point, but I do think we have some pretty good numbers looking back over the last 12 months. And hopefully some of the actions that we've taken because we've had to comply with these OSHA requirements since the temp rules went in place last summer, that hopefully we're not going to incur additional costs if we've already done implemented some permanent solutions that moving forward we're able to comply with.
Thanks.
I have not to exhaust this issue, but I have a quick follow-up question. So we have, in terms of OSHA related rules and compliance, is it one compliance officer under HHS? Is that correct?
Are you referencing through like environmental health? Or I guess just county as a whole, I think Ken would have to answer.
In terms of, you know, OSHA's requirements and whether businesses are complying with these rules or not, the code compliance officers that go out and do that work.
I can speak to the internal, you know, because the internal, I mean, because we're subject like any other employer to comply with OSHA. So that's really centrally located with our HR division, and then in further working with our management team and our safety committee and things like that, as far as internal compliance that we work on. As far as external, Lindsay can talk about the environmental health specialists that are in public health, but otherwise OSHA enforces OSHA regulations. That's not a function that we do at the county, but Lindsay.
Sure. So we have 3 individuals that make up 2.8 FTE of environment, 3.2. So I'm looking at Christina. Yes, thank you. 3.2 FTE of our environmental health program. That has not shifted or changed throughout this event. They are in charge of our restaurants, food, pool, and lodging, essentially. And they do inspections, as regulated by the Oregon Health Authority for people who are serving food, and then lodging that charges fees, things like that. So that has not changed or increased in the course of this event. Some of their duties have been related to some of the requirements for OSHA, but only in the purview of which we already regulated. So we license and regulate, like I said, food, pool, and lodging. So those are the only complaints that they follow up on in terms of compliance, is when it fits into what we're already overseeing, what we already regulate.
Okay, so if OSHA's rules around masks, social distancing, all that kind of stuff are made permanent, do you anticipate needing to hire more code compliance folks?
Not based on what we're seeing currently, right? So the majority of these things, so all of our restaurants are required to be inspected every 9 months. And so certainly if they're on site and they see any sort of violations of any of the regulations, including those related to COVID, they will address them on site. And then they will address any sort of what I would consider a standalone complaints that may come. Those come to us in many forms, and that's what they do. We get complaints. Some are COVID related, some might be non-COVID related to any of those organizations, and so they would continue to follow up. But that is not an area I would anticipate any increases in, especially related to COVID.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have an unusual question, and please bear with me when I try to formulate my thought. And it goes back to a lot of what we were discussing, but as we're budgeting looking forward with COVID, and of course we're hoping we don't need that much, but I realize there's a very granular process to what COVID funds can be used for, and clearly you do an amazing job tracking granularity. But in the event that the larger funds are accounted for, as things shift and change, and it's so hard to budget already and then to amend along the way, is there room to deal with the other things that are now kind of coming on board with COVID? I mean, OSHA is one of the questions. And similarly, we also have, so there's vaccine injuries coming up and other things where, the solutions for COVID are also causing other conditions. And so your department would be heavily impacted with things like higher suicide rates or abuse, alcohol abuse or something, those areas. But also, vaccine injury. So how fungible is that money? And when things kind of change and the need for those things to be addressed, can they be addressed with those same funds?
So I will give an answer of maybe, and I'll go more into more detail. So certainly, like any budget or any funding stream, right, it all depends on that specific funding, right? The CARES Act dollars were for a very specific thing, as are the recovery plan dollars for very specific things. But the state has made available through things like CARES Act, various funding streams that can be used for some of the things that you're mentioning related to behavioral health and things like that. So one example that I will give is some of the CARES Act dollars came specifically to us, not for COVID response in terms of our public health response, but really for how COVID might be impacting our behavioral health divisions and how it might be impacting our clients. That funding stream gave us a lot more flexibility to be able to do outreach and engagement and things that are challenging to do in the sort of general Medicaid world because they're not encounterable, meaning we can't bill for them or we can't encounter against our CCO budget and things like that. So those funds were really helpful helpful for us to be able to be more creative and have staff doing more general outreach and engagement to work with community members or perhaps clients that we hadn't seen for a while in an effort to again, reestablish relationships and things like that. I will say we are lucky. We have not seen any shifts or increases in our deaths by suicide rates in Yamhill County, for which we're grateful for. Of course, any loss of life is incredibly impactful for everyone, including the community. So don't want to downplay that at all, but it is, we have not seen an increase in that. I will say that we are concerned about alcohol and drug use, and I think that we are seeing increased rates of relapse and things like that. And so we're doing our best to respond to that in our community through kind of two lenses. One, of course, is the behavioral health work, right? So the engagement with clients, working with organizations like Provoking Hope, with certified recovery mentors who go out into the community and try to reach people where they're at. So really making sure that those connections are strong, doing what we can to engage clients to come in for services and begin treatment or stick with treatment, as well as work through public health, right? So we've got this whole public health wing of prevention that is really looking at upstream root causes of things like suicide or alcohol and drug use. And their work is on that primary prevention of how do we prevent these things from even getting to the point where people need to engage in treatment. So we're really working at that on two different levels continually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, we covered a number of things that I was just going to sort of wrap up with in terms of threats and opportunities, right? So it was a really great discussion. I think overall, the things that we're watching and we're concerned about are impacts related to COVID-19, quite honestly, as well as our overall personnel costs that continue to go up. I mentioned some of those, particularly this year, but we know that PERS continue to escalate and all of those things. So we're continuing to watch those things. A couple of the opportunities, I know we already talked about, public health modernization, we're watching closely. The telehealth that we think really will provide opportunity to people who may not have engaged in treatment before. Our school services partnerships remain strong, and we're really excited to have kids back in the classroom. Our counselors are really excited to have kids back in the classroom, and it's wonderful to be able to engage in those ways that we have not been able to do in the same way as the kids have been out of the schools. And then I would also just lastly point out that there are a number of new opportunities coming to us that we're paying close attention to, including the CCO Share Initiative fundings, which is really CCO funding that the CCOs around the state are required to reinvest into the community for things related to social determinants of health. And we're really excited to be working and partnering with our CCO to be thinking about how this can be invested in our community. One area that we know that they're very excited about is how they can help support our Sheridan Housing Project, and really creating that space to be something where people want to live, where they want to be, where there's where it's a safe community for people who are in recovery to really live sort of thriving lives. So we've got, despite the number of challenges we have faced this year and we continue to face, I think we've also got a lot of really wonderful opportunities. And then the last thing I want to just mention is, while this is not necessarily a threat or an opportunity, is really Measure 110. And we know that that's going to have an impact. We're not quite sure exactly what that impact is going to look like right now. Right? So Measure 110 is the measure that was voted by Oregonians to really change sort of some of the rules and regulations around possession and of narcotics and things like that to a citation-based methodology. So this means that people who are cited for possession or having things like heroin on them or using heroin, really they have two options. They get cited for a citation that has a fee of roughly $100 associated with it, or they can engage in a behavioral health screening and have that fee waived. At this moment in time, we really don't know what that's going to have in terms of an impact. I don't know if that's going to increase people coming into our services or decrease people coming into our services. We certainly hope that it's going to be increasing, and we are doing everything that we can to partner with our courts, with our community justice partners, with our CCO, and with organizations like Provoking Hope to have a good plan in place so that we can do everything in our power to help folks use that as a moment to make a shift in their lives and be able to come in and get treatment that we hope will really serve them well. So we're watching that really closely, and we're doing things like writing for grants and things like that to really make sure that our community is poised well once there's full understanding of what those regulations are going to be, as the rules have not been written yet for all of that. Those are really the highlights of our sort of what we have in anticipation coming this year. Just want to take another moment to say thank you to my management team. It has been a long year for them. They've done tremendous work every single day, from our COVID response to just being leaders in a large, multifaceted organization through the pandemic, having to shift and change, work with staff, being on-site and off-site, launching telehealth, all of these things that have been enormous lifts, and they've done such an amazing job. They've done it so gracefully, and I am just so proud to be part of the organization that has all of them here. So I really thank all of you for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any other questions if there are any.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay and Christina.
Nice job.
Okay.
All right,
Sure.
guys. And we are a little early on this. Are there anything else we can cover while we're?
I'm looking at my list and seeing if there was other items that I could cover in 20 minutes. And sometimes we'll do this. I'm not sure if I have anything that I'm prepared that we could probably fill in the 20 minutes. So it looks like we're a little bit ahead of schedule. Maybe we take a 5-minute recess and I'll see what I can come up with, and then we can come back, and then that way not everybody's looking at me on screen while I'm going through my notebook.
We'd be looking at you if we were in person too.
Well, you cut out. I didn't hear. Are we breaking then?
I would
for lunch?
suggest like a 5-minute recess, and then I can come
Okay.
back and I can pick some of the smaller
Good.
funds that maybe I can go over really quickly.
All right, we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll see you back.
Thank you.
We ready to bring this meeting back to order? All right, let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you for the 5 minutes to get myself on the scramble so we can take advantage of the next 10 minutes. And I'm looking at some smaller funds that we're going to go to. Carrie, could you add Mike Barnhart to the panel? And so I want to introduce, oh, he was here and then there he is. I want to introduce our finance manager, Mike Barnhart. And so what I'm going to do is if you turn to page 96 in your budget binder, and we're going to go over Fund 15-85. This is a really small fund.
Good morning, everybody, committee and commissioners.
Morning.
So this is the county school fund. So this is a pass-through fund. We get money from federal forest receipts, and that money is required to be sent out to county schools. It comes in basically April, May every year. It's an annual allotment. And then we send the entire amount out to the schools by June 30th. So you're going to see there at this point, we just got the revenue in April, just after these reports were printed. We got about $35,000 and we'll be sending that out plus any interest, along with electric co-op money we get as well to the county schools. So the fund typically equals around zero fund balance at the end. However, for next year's budget, we typically budget about what we get in for the electric co-op, $12,000. We typically budget a little higher for federal forest funds, just in case it comes in, because we have to send it all out. If we under budget for any of these revenues, then we kind of get stuck with the budget violation if we don't have enough authority. So we typically put about $85K in for federal forest, and then the entire amount, interest and everything, is set there as distribution to schools in account 9401 to pay the entire amount out. So that's all there is to this fund.
That was easy.
I know, simple, huh?
Yes.
Ken gives me the softballs. I appreciate it sometimes.
All right. Hey, thanks, Mike. Any questions on Fund 15? All right. So the next one, I thought we would have some time. If you turn to page 127, and you'll see a tab for non-departmental. I'll give everybody a moment to find the page.
What's it called, Ken, again?
It's non-departmental.
Okay.
The
Fund
tab
1030.
says internal services.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just behind internal services.
Got it.
All right, is everybody ready? So I'm going to go, these are some general funds, some budgetary funds that we have set up for handling a variety of expenses. Starting with 1039. Fund 1039 is non-departmental, and this is primarily discretionary revenue, except for you will see 95,000 for the Newburgh bypass, and that's funding that we received from the other partners or members of the Parkway Committee for the lobbyist fees that we received. So we record that here. 1039, these are expenses that aren't necessarily attributed to one single department. That's why we call it non-departmental. And so the revenues that you're going to see that we forecasted and projected 142,000 in non-discretionary revenue, and the remainder is going to be an allocation amount from 10002. I know a lot of times when folks are still looking at the budget, it looks confusing that you have 142,000 in revenue, but we have $902,000 in expense, and it's like, well, where do we balance? We balanced a fund 10002, which is where our discretionary funds are located. So down in expenses, there's not any major changes, except for there was an increase in the professional services contract 1039 610.01, and that's anticipated. The board approved some increased service levels for the lobbyist that is engaged with lobbying for the bypass. And so you'll see that amount there reflective. It balances with the Newburgh bypass 330.01. So that was increased. And so we're going to see increased contributions from the various cities. And so then that's why that expense line was increased to match that revenue. The other items, there really wasn't any significant change. We have saw some increases with the medical examiner. This is something that we pay for at a 1039, the bills for the two medical examiners that we have. So when they're called out, we pay for that with discretionary funds out of Fund 1039. So we did see a renewed contract with some increased costs associated with that. And then down below, what you're going to see in the 780 lines, you'll see internal property insurance, internal liability insurance. Those two lines for all Fund 10 departments that are funded by general fund monies, they don't pay directly into insurance reserve. We pay for all Fund 10 departments at a 1039 into Fund 80 to pay for our insurance liability renewals and our property renewals. The other departments like HHS, who is not a general fund department, they're invoiced directly. You'll see a similar transfer code in their line that they do their own transfer based on a formula into Fund 80. For the most part, this is status quo. What looks a little unusual, if you're looking at the year-to-date actual or the current adopted budget for the current year, you're going to see the 1.4 million in other expense that was booked there, and it was also as a new state grant up above. That was that additional allocation of CARES Act that the state gave to the county to facilitate a third round of business grants. And so that was the program I talked about in December of 20. We did $1.4 million in business emergency grants, that distribution of that. You're not seeing it budgeted for in this year because, again, that was something that kind of sprung up mid-year. We did a supplemental budget to add that budgetary line, and we didn't increase the revenues in 1039 to reflect any other grant programs. We have some other funds that we historically use for grant programs. And for ARPA funds, later this week, as I mentioned, we're going to be making a request to set up a new special revenue fund that'll be specific for those ARPA funds and how we receive it, track it, and spend it. So it's going to be tracked in its own fund. Any questions on 1039?
Ken, I have a question about the COG dues.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be something that, because of the GIS component, that part of that goes to planning, or why wouldn't that be considered dues?
This is strictly for our dues. The GIS portion of the COG contract is actually paid for out of planning. We do a discretionary transfer for that amount directly to planning, and then they pay for the GIS. So the 16,000, or I'm sorry, I need to make sure I'm looking. I need to put my glasses back on. Sorry.
And Doreen, this is Council on Governments, which is an intergovernment organization that we pay dues to. And you could, maybe Ken, you could explain the GIS difference and why it goes to planning?
That's good because COG in banking means cost of goods.
Right. Yeah.
Good to know.
So COG is actually the Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. So what we have here is the Council of Governments line 700.04. That is strictly, that's for our dues for being a member of the Council of Governments. And then we have some other funds that you will see in a presentation when Ken Friday presents the planning department budget, that we also contract with COG for GIS services, and we have a direct payment out of planning to COG for those GIS services.
Can you explain GIS?
GIS is a geographic information system. It's a mapping software.
From space, we do lot lines.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's always good to remind me on the acronyms so at least the ones I know. So, all right. Any other questions on 1039? All right. If you want to, I'm seeing I'm right at noon, but if you don't mind, I have two more that I could go over really quickly if the chair is okay with that before we break for lunch.
Go ahead.
I'm okay with it. Nobody else has any objections.
All right. If you want to turn the page to page 128, and I'm going to go over Fund 30, which is O&C Title III funds. So the one caveat that I always put into this one is if you look at line 332.01, we have $10,000 budgeted. And also in 332.02 federal forest funds, we also budgeted 10,000. That's a placeholder. We don't know because it's up to the feds if we're going to see any funding coming from O&C and specifically for Title III. Everything that we have that we build into this, essentially we have an $81,000 beginning balance. This fund has a long history. I remember when we were getting more robust allocations that was supporting several different programs within the county, but then that all stopped. So really we have that beginning balance at 81,000 that's a holdover from many years ago that, again, it hasn't been spent during the previous fiscal year. I will say just kind of add to, we typically hold the expense authority under grants awarded, but there's a whole process involved in order to award grants out of these Title III funds. And it's also very specific on what we can spend these funds on. We have some amount that if the sheriff needs to initiate a search and rescue on federal lands, these are funds that could be used to reimburse that. The other thing is this is also available for proposals for doing Firewise communities. And the one thing that I will share with you, it'll be included in the packet at tonight's hearing. We did get a proposal from Soil and Water Conservation District for doing some Firewise programs in the new fiscal year. So that'll be something that's on the deliberation list and will be included in the packet, but they have a $10,000 ask of Title III funds for doing that program. So, and that's gonna, unlike some of the other proposals that we're gonna see later tonight, this one's specific to Title III. That's what they're asking for funds for. So again, there's really limitations on what we can use these funds for based on federal guidelines. We don't have a lot of revenue coming into it. We've been carrying a small balance that's only really been increasing because of the pool and bond interest that we earn each year. But we do have, we really have that 81,000, a little more than $82,000 available for grants. But again, we appropriated the full amount in case we do receive additional revenue from Title III. Any questions on Title III? I know you're all thinking, how can I turn such a short, small budget into a 30-minute presentation? That's what I do. So the next one, if you want to turn the page to page 129, we can talk about, this is another federal fund. This is Fund 50. Mike, were you going to do this one, or was I doing this one, or were we going to team up on this one?
You mentioned doing it all to see how much revenue came in for the year.
All right. So this is another one. Again, it's O&C funds. It's subject to whether or not we actually see any funds coming from the federal government that comes in. We do have a placeholder of 100,000. There has been some legislative discussion about possibly some funds coming through SRS. So maybe we might see some funds this, I'm not seeing anything this current fiscal year. We have a pretty good beginning balance, as you can tell, the $746,000. you know, so when you're looking at the total revenue, the 852,000, a majority of that is, again, unspent funds that we've carried forward each year. These are for typically historically have been used for one-time grants or projects either approved through the budget process, but historically we've also fully appropriated this fund for requests that may come during the next fiscal year. So if there's a project that the board deems as a priority and they want to fund it, then we have some of these funds available that are fully appropriated that we could do one-time grants. There's not the limitations like under the Title III funds. These are more of a discretionary type fund that can be used for any purpose. So, so we do have some expenses that we do record to this, but a majority of it you're going to see that we keep recorded in 699.01. A good example on why we appropriate this full amount is if you look at the year-to-date actual, you'll see some reimbursement and you'll see some actual expense recorded under other expense. This was one of those categories that we had appropriation authority to help facilitate grants for business grants. So we were able to do some business grants out of this fund, but then we ended up reimbursing this fund with CARES Act funds to make it whole and preserve those O&C funds. But again, it's one of those mechanics that it's nice to have the flexibility to have some appropriation built into this. So then when the board receives a grant proposal or we're in a crisis situation or like what we've gone through in the last 12 months, it provides some flexibility to help fund some of these community requests that may come forward. You'll also see this on Wednesday, when I send you the deliberation list. This is one of those categories that if we receive requests that the committee's like, yes, it's recommended to fund this, these are funds available to help fund those community requests or grant projects that may come up over the next 3 days. Anything to add on that, Mike? I'm not seeing that we've recorded any new funds coming in this year.
The revenue typically comes in May, so we don't have it in yet if it's even shown up.
Right. All right. So any questions on Fund 50? I think that's what I had for the small fillers that we won't have to talk about later this afternoon during admin.
All right. When I say we adjourn for lunch, meet back at 1:30. All right.